Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be addressing you today about process planning. My name is Erica Fujimoto, and I am Director of Default Services at Affinity Consulting Group. One of the main things I do with my clients is process planning and process mapping and process improvement. And when I say it's one of the main things I do, I've probably spent hundreds of hours doing it here at Affinity. So I think I am well equipped to talk to you all about this topic today. So I want to get started by talking a little bit. And before I start, I'm so sorry. Before I get started, just so that everybody knows, you are able to ask questions in the chat, and Karen will be my helper here, and she'll be letting me know about those as we go through the presentation. So don't hesitate if you have any questions to let us know, and Karen will just jump in and interrupt me. So with that, I wanted to start by talking about why firms process map. Obviously, it's for a variety of different reasons. One of the main reasons that I do it with my clients is because I do a lot of software implementations. Firms purchase a new software product, and we want to figure out what is the firm's process so that we can get that built into the system. That might mean that we're building workflow. Maybe your firm might actually work from a task-based process. And in that case, we might be building that workflow into your system. It might also mean that we are simply building in how you do things. That enters into it a little bit as well. And we may also find that you're doing it because you are having procedure changes. Maybe you want to map out a standard operating procedure. So that's another reason that we might be mapping out the process so that we can build out a standard operating procedure to ensure that everything that you do in your firm is documented. You might be trying to identify issues or trying to fix issues. So if you, for example, have a particular issue that you know that there's something that isn't going right, you know that there's a problem and you're not exactly sure what that problem is, you might map out the process to see if that can help you to identify that issue and define it more clearly. Or you might have already determined that there's an issue, and you might be mapping out the process to try to fix and resolve that particular issue. So there's lots of different reasons why law firms map their processes. In terms of what I was just talking about with regard to determining that there's an issue in advance and then mapping out the process to fix that issue, or mapping out the process in order to find the issues, it's hard to figure out which you should do first. And really, the important thing here is that it actually doesn't matter at all why you're doing it. What's really important is that you're doing it in the first place. For me, I'm really passionate about process mapping and process improvement because I see a logical connection between the act of mapping out the process, doing that process improvement, exploiting the technology to make the process better. That might be in terms of how the process is worked. It might be how you automate the process. Maybe there's things that you can have your team save time on doing because you can automate those actions in your systems that you're using, your software that you're using at your firm. Maybe it's building out reporting capabilities so that you can ensure that you're not dropping the ball or missing activities that you should not be missing. Maybe you're trying to reduce resources in some way. And all of that really starts, the ability to make decisions that make sense and are based on data and experience starts with mapping out our process. And so, like I said, it doesn't actually matter if we already know that we have an issue or if we don't know that we have an issue and we're trying to figure out what that issue is. Mapping out the process is going to help us with both of them. I think I'm all about the cliches today. I want to talk a little bit about the elephant in the room, and that is that in my experience, and this is not 100%, nothing is, so please don't be offended as I say this, working from a process is a foreign concept to most attorneys that I've worked with. They don't see what they do as a process. So getting them to sit down and actually map that out is really tough, even just to get started. My history in the legal industry, while I have worked for a full service firm, I was a paralegal for a really long time at a full service firm, but even then, my primary area was always real estate. Foreclosure, bankruptcy, evictions, closings, litigation. That's really where a lot of my expertise is. But because I've worked in a full service firm as well, I have been exposed to a lot of what general litigation looks like, contract law, all different types of law. And the one thing I can say is that they all have a process. Sometimes in the legal world, uncovering that process might be a little bit difficult. And sometimes the process varies so much that you might really struggle to see it as a process and define it and map it out. For example, say that you're negotiating terms of a settlement agreement, and the process might be that you send the terms back and forth, you prepare the agreement, you get the signatures, et cetera. But in the middle of all of that, they might not agree. And you might have to go down a completely different path. Maybe you're going to have to file a lawsuit when you didn't think that you were going to, or you're going to have to proceed to trial if you've already done that and you weren't planning on doing that. Even though that is sort of an offshoot to the process, it's still a path that you might have to go on, and it doesn't nullify the fact that what you were doing was still a process. It's just that the process might have different paths that you might follow based on what's happening in the case. Even if the process is as simple as 2 tasks, it's still a process that you can map out. It lends itself to mapping, and it may even lend itself to improving and the process in order to, maximize your productivity. For example, when we're talking about, that agreement, maybe your paralegal is sending it to the wrong person or not following up. They don't have a tickler system in place that prompts them to go ahead and follow up, even though all they're doing is sending it and following up to receive it back, sending it and following up, receiving it back, sort of rinse and repeat. That's still a process. And if we find that we're not getting agreements signed as quickly as we might want to, or they're not getting to the right person, then that might be an issue that we've uncovered by mapping out that process and figuring out that we need to make a change to that process. Something else that I think happens oftentimes in firms is that somebody has to calendar. A lot of firms have, calendar clerks or a paralegal who's calendaring different events on the calendar, whether it's follow-ups for orders to be entered, whether it's actual hearings and trials and events that you're actually attending. But in addition to that, a lot of firms are calendaring for things like following up for an order to be entered, checking the docket after a deadline has passed, to see if someone's filed a response to a motion. Getting that, the process, the act of getting that onto the calendar is a process. And in some firms, I've found that, most firms, there are multiple calendars going around. You have each attorney has their own calendar, for example. The paralegals may have their own calendars. And then you may also have a shared calendar that everyone's looking at for attending events or for those deadlines and follow-ups that we're talking about. And some things may go on to all of the calendars. Some things may only go on to one of the calendars. And what can really become a big mess is when multiple people are adding them. The same event might be added to 3 different calendars by 3 different people. And so that's a process that we want to look at. What is our calendaring process, and what can we do to make improvements to that process? So there's lots of things that we can do to make our jobs faster and become more efficient while maintaining quality. For me, that's always important, is that we want to maintain the quality. So even when I'm talking about automation and things that we can do with the software to make our processes better, to make us more efficient, and to get the results that we're ultimately after, we don't want to sacrifice the quality. And so taking the time to map out that process and make decisions based on what we've mapped out can really be an effective way to make improvements in our firms. So with that, step 1 to mapping out the process and improving at your firm is actually acknowledging and realizing that there is a process. And please don't get me wrong. I'm definitely not saying that you have to work from a task-based system in order to have a process. and in order to get benefit from mapping out that process. I'm simply saying that a process exists, and recognizing that really is the first step to mapping it out and improving on it. So with that, I thought it would be good to share some examples of processes in a law firm. And I'll start with legal processes. So for example, there are legal processes around our case management, how we track our cases, how we ensure that we're following up, how we prioritize work. How do we know which pleading we're going to prepare before the other, which case we're going to work before the other, where we're going to put the emphasis and the work today as opposed to what we're going to do tomorrow. All of that is the work that we have to do to get all of our legal work done, but there's a process around how we make those decisions. Time entry, how you're tracking. If you're a firm that bills hourly time, how are you tracking that hourly time? And what are your requirements around the same? So for example, are your attorneys and paralegals, if they're billing their time, are they required to enter it contemporaneously as they go? Or do they have rules about what time it has to be entered in by every day? Does it just have to be entered in by the end of the week? Does it have to be entered in by the time that they bill? I mean, there's many different types of rules that you may have set around that. Time entry, you may have required a certain minimum amount of time entry, and you have a process around how you're tracking that, how you're reporting on that, what happens when people don't do it and don't adhere to those requirements. There's processes around all of those things. I already talked about calendaring, so I'll kind of skip through this one, but where you're calendaring, who calendars, what's being calendared. Your file management and organization itself. For example, some firms are paperless or fileless, and some firms are working from physical files, and some do a combination of both. So how your documents are saved, how your files are organized. A lot of firms have the 6-clip system, if you will, and they have things that get saved into certain clips. What are your policies for organizing and saving all of your documents, whether they're being saved in a physical file or an electronic file or both? How your documents get drafted. For some of you, you may have form templates that are automated out of your systems, and for some of you, you may have form templates that people just type over. Those form templates, do you have a way to maintain them so that people are using the right one? A lot of firms will have a form template. Every paralegal has their own form templates, and they all differ, and there's no consistency. And some firms actually want to take that and have that be very consistent, and so that everybody is using the same set, whether it's an automated form or a non-automated form. And some firms don't have templates at all. Everything sort of gets started from scratch every time. All of that, though, makes up your process for document drafting. Once the document's been drafted, who is editing that document? How are they editing it? What is that process? What does it take to get documents drafted and move them through the process? Attorney reviews, attorney editing, all of that work is part of your legal process. We also have processes that are non-legal processes. So for example, sales and marketing. If your firm is doing sales and marketing, that may be you and it may not be you. You might have a department that's responsible for doing that, but all of these type of, operational items I wanted to include here as well, because these are all processes that are being worked in your firm to keep your firm going and to keep your business making money and active. And so, for example, with sales and marketing, we might be talking about your marketing plan, how you reach out to potential clients, how you follow up, how you track that information. Maybe you're using a system to track that information. Maybe you're not. A lot of times we talk to firms who would love to use some kind of a system to track their potential clients, and they haven't actually looked at something. There are lots of systems out there that we could talk about, but all of that is part of that sales and marketing process. How are we actually actively marketing our business? Operations, this is a big one for me. New employee onboarding and offboarding is really huge for me. Here at Affinity, we have developed a pretty robust onboarding and offboarding program where we have checklists that we have to get through. We have multiple people involved in the process. We have a software program that we're utilizing to help facilitate our onboarding and our offboarding. And there's an entire process built around how we take a potential employee from the point of initial interview, or even possibly before that, on taking their resume and reviewing their resume, to how we interview that person, to how we make an offer to that person, to the pre-onboarding activities that we might need to do, purchasing computers and getting them business cards and all the different things that we might need to do before they start working. And then everything up until 6 to 9 months after the person has started and getting all of that training. There's an entire process built out around that in our company, and most law firms have all of those activities that they need to do as well. Another operational item is how you might have to respond to audits. If you have corporate clients, for example, they might be auditing you. You might be answering technology audits. You might be answering process-related audits. All different types of auditing is happening. And in fact, you may actually be sending out audits. You might do vendor management. And if you're working, for example, with Affinity, you might be sending me an audit questionnaire for me to answer. And the process that you follow to make sure that you've updated that audit questionnaire, that you're sending it out regularly, that you're receiving it back, that you're reviewing the responses, all of that, there's a process around all of that. We also have technology processes. So how you implement, manage, and upkeep your systems, hardware and software, if you have a change management policy surrounding those activities, so what process and procedure you need to go through in order to make changes to your technology. New client intake, I hear a lot about this one from law firms, especially law firms who are not working with corporate clients. I feel like the firms who work with corporate clients have a little bit of an easier time with this. Maybe they don't have quite as many clients. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe the onboarding is a little bit easier, but I especially hear when people are working with individuals that getting all of their information, getting everything that they need to get back from them can sometimes be like pulling teeth, and setting up new matters can be a really time-consuming process. And so working that out, mapping that out, looking for efficiencies and trying to improve on that is something that we see a lot of law firms trying to do. Billing and accounting. This is a big one because, of course, it's what keeps the lights on, right? So how you invoice, how you pay your vendors, if you invoice, how you pay your vendors, how you collect your retainers, everything surrounding the billing and accounting process is something that you can map out and, again, look at making improvements to. Last but not least in my examples, and I will be honest and tell you, I probably threw these examples together in about 20 or 30 minutes. So I think I could probably list out hundreds of different things that are different processes that are being worked in a law firm, but just wanted to share a few with you. So the last one I have in my list here is mailroom, your mailroom processes, how you are processing your incoming and outgoing mail, how you're dealing with that mail, how you get it scanned in if you're scanning it in, how it gets into the files, how it gets saved, does it actually get delivered to somebody? We have a firm that we worked with years ago. I loved it. They pretty much scanned and shredded everything, and that was part of their process. And so all of these are different types of processes that you might be following and working and could lend themselves to mapping in your firm. That brings us to step 2, which is selecting an area to start our process mapping with. Again, with my cliches, it sometimes is very difficult to see the forest for the trees. And if your attorneys really have a hard time with seeing that there is a process to the legal work that they're doing, you might want to start with one of the areas outside of the legal work that I mentioned in terms of your process mapping, your first process mapping project. So if you've never at your firm sat down and tried to map out a process end to end with every detail that you can possibly include, you might want to start with a non-legal process. And that might get you some traction to get started in the right direction. And then later on, you could move on to mapping out one of your legal process areas. For me, when I'm making a decision about the area to start with, I personally prefer to start where we believe that the most perceived impact, that we perceive that the biggest impact, if you will, can be made. And oftentimes that is an area that is either closely related to our revenue or closely related to how many resources we need, and I guess then in that case to expenses. So how many, if we look at areas that really have an impact over a large group of people, that might be an area to start with. And sometimes it's just necessary for us to start with a certain area because that area is going to have such an impact on the other areas, and it's going to influence what we decide to do with other areas, that we uncover the first project, if you will, to do with our mapping based on that. So in order to make that decision, what I find it is helpful to do is to start documenting the issues even before you're making a decision and you're deciding to process map. If you know of issues already, identifying those issues and actually writing them down, because we oftentimes think, oh, I'll deal with that when we work on that project, and we most of the time forget what those issues were. When I ask people what issues are you having, they're like, oh my gosh, you put me on the spot. But in preparation for talking to me, I would hope that people were already doing that, but I find that that's something that most people don't think to do. So this is a really important step, is as people are working, encourage them to write down any issues that they think of, because then you're able to take that and that can help you to make this decision about which area you want to start with. For example, you might be looking for inefficiencies in the process, inconsistencies. You might be looking at people problems. You might be looking at areas where your firm has dropped the ball. Maybe you've missed hearings or you've missed deadlines, and that might be an area that you want to look at. You might be having some technology problems. Just essentially what you want to be thinking about is things that you wish worked better. So once you have that, that would really be something that could help you to narrow this down and figure out what area you would like to start with mapping. Another thing that you might want to be thinking about is who's going to be involved. Sometimes in our firms, we have people who are going to be resistant to change. And oftentimes we know that mapping out the process is going to lend itself to making change and making improvements. But if the people who are going to be participating in our first project especially are people who are really resistant to change, then it might make the project a little bit harder. So you might want to start in areas with people who are excited about making changes, with people who believe that changes are needed and who want to be part of that solution. So you may be picking your project based on who your participants are. Step 3 is obvious, our mapping of the process. And for the purposes of keeping this session on time, I'm not going to focus on the tool that you use. Suffice it to say that there are many tools out there. I personally like to do my initial mapping in Word and then transfer it to another medium if I need to. A lot of firms will do it in Excel. They might do it in a flowchart program like Visio. Heck, you can even do it with Post-its on a wall. You want to pick what you're drawn to and what you have readily accessible and available to you. You certainly don't want your process mapping to be put on hold for 6 months while your firm agrees on a software product to use, and then gets fee approval and purchases that software product and whatever you need to do. You don't want that to hold you back. So just remember, grab your Post-its and start putting it on a wall. If you have a whiteboard, you could start writing it on a whiteboard. You can, do it in Word if you need to. You can pretty much map process however you want. But and if you do start with something and you end up getting a software product later to do it, you can always convert what you've done into that method, but just don't get mired in the tool selection. Start with what you have so you can get started quickly. The important part for process mapping is that you're detailed and you're thorough, and that you're mapping the process from end to end, no matter what tool you're using. Remember that you can always take things out later, but if you're going to do the work, you don't want to do it twice. So adding everything in and then removing items later is always the way to go. And make sure that you're also mapping out all of your decision points. You want to be really thorough in what you're mapping. Now, when you're doing process mapping, there's always a decision that needs to be made. And that decision is going to be, are you going to map your current state or your future state? So the current state is, what do we do today? And that is literally sitting down and mapping, again, end to end, what we do today. Mapping the future state is mapping what we want the process to be in the future. Now, most firms find that mapping the current state and having that as a current state map, and then taking a copy of that map and adjusting it to our future state is preferable to trying to do both at the same time. If you do that, then there is a huge benefit because we can see what the process is today. And as we're making adjustments to that process, it will lend itself to ensuring that we touch every area that we're impacting as we make the changes. So I will say that the most accepted way to do this is to map the current state and then adjust it into your future state. With that said, that method is much more time consuming. And so for me, when I'm mapping, if you've ever mapped with me, you may find that I'm trying to do both at once because I need to save my clients time and money. And so doing it that way, we oftentimes find is just, it saves a little bit of time. And the way that I do it, and again, I map process for hundreds of hours. So if you're not used to doing that, it's also harder to map the current state while building the future state at the same time. So you may choose not to do that, especially if you're doing it on your own. But a lot of times what I'm doing is we're mapping out the current process and we're identifying the issues as we go. And as we're doing that, we're making adjustments and tweaking the process right there, right then at that same time. So it's, again, a little bit more complicated to do it this way. And really, I think that the only benefit is that it saves a little bit of time. But again, I would highly recommend that if you're making a decision as to which way to go and you have the time to do it, then I would recommend that doing it on your own, especially that you would map out your current state first, because that's really going to help you to have something concrete. It's definable, you know what it is. And essentially, for a lot of you, you may not be able to see the issues right away. And so mapping out the process might be what's helping you to identify those issues as you go. But just so that you know, you can do it either way. Some of the questions that you might want to be asking as you are mapping the process is what happens when something doesn't go according to plan? We expected the judge would enter an order, but he set a hearing instead. We requested info from opposing counsel and we expected to receive back that info, but what if they don't provide it? Is there another way to get it, or is there something else that we have to do at that point? So essentially you want to be asking, what do I do when things don't go according to the plan? You want to include who's going to be performing each task and whether that person is internal to your firm or external. So this might be, you know that you're going to receive back an order entered by the court. And so we know that the court is the one entering the order and we're receiving it back. And so you may want to be documenting that. You might want to be documenting tasks and pieces to the puzzle that are being done by your clients or other people, your vendors. Expected timelines. And for me, this includes both your durations and your delays. So you want to be keeping track of how long it takes from start to finish to do a particular item. Maybe preparing a pleading might take a day, it might take a few hours, it might take multiple days. And then delays refers to how long it takes between one task and another. I sent an order to the court, how long is it going to take me to get that order back entered from the court? Keeping track of what the predecessor is to each of the tasks that you're mapping out. So what needs to be done before something else can be done, or what can be done simultaneously. Which tasks are optional? I like to write down if something is optional. And if there are conditional tasks, and if so, what are the business rules? So for example, you might have certain tasks that you only do when it's a certain judge or a certain court. For example, if you're setting a hearing in a certain court, you may have to actually file the notice of hearing. So you might need to obtain that date in some way for the hearing so that you can prepare that notice. And in other courts, they may issue the notice of hearing, and so you might not need to do anything. And so that's a conditional task that may differ with business rules such as who the court or the judge is. Step 4 is to identify and document your issues. So you already started doing this before you mapped out the process, and so you should continue it as you're going through the process of mapping, and make sure that you document every issue you find as soon as you identify it. Write it down somewhere, because I promise you, you will not remember, even if you think you will. There are so many times that we've forgotten, oh, we thought we would fix that later and we just didn't. So you want to be looking for things like bottlenecks, things that too many people are involved in, things where you could have less people involved, but again, still get the same quality out of what you're doing. You want to look for areas where you have too many file touches. You might find that you might need data to truly understand the scope. And so you might find that you need to do some reporting. You might need to build some timeline measurements, receivables measurements, maybe contemporaneous time entry scores, in order to figure out ultimately, while you're mapping out that process, you might need to do some reporting that goes along with it to give us the information that we need. And last but not least, you want to be working on improving the process. So once you identify those issues, you want to work through each of the issues to streamline your process or improve your quality, determine how you're going to deal with each issue, keeping in mind that in some cases you might need external help to do that. For example, if you don't know the full capabilities of your case management system, you might want to engage outside help to do that. Maybe you might come to somebody like us at Affinity, or you might have a person internal to your firm who wasn't involved in the process mapping but knows your case management system, and you might need to get that person involved. You want to make sure that you're not forgetting to detail every piece of what needs to change, whether you're changing internal policies, written standard operating procedures, whether you're changing job descriptions for people, whether you're changing your technology. And you want to be sure that you're looking at things that aren't issues necessarily, but also anything that you could do to improve the process. So you want to be looking at all of that. At the end, once you have your future state map, if you will, then you'll move into actually implementing all of those changes. And remembering that it may not be perfect the first time around. You might need to keep tweaking it. Your process and your technology are both constantly evolving. So you're constantly going to be needing to look back at them to make your improvements. And then you'll be ready to tackle your next project and start mapping the next area. So that is everything I have for you today. Karen, I don't think there were any questions, but I'm not looking at the chat. If you all want to contact me, you have my contact information here, and Karen will also be uploading a copy of this PowerPoint and the video of today's webinar. So I want to thank you all for attending. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can contact Karen to schedule a 30-minute consultation, and I would encourage you all to check out all of our webinars at the bit.ly ACG webinars link listed at the bottom here. Thank you all and have a great day.